Welcome, everybody, to tonight's presentation. We are very pleased to have Dr. Adriana Brodsky here from the East Coast. I will say first that I am Estelle Tarica. I'm a professor of Latin American Studies in Spanish and Portuguese and in Jewish Studies. And I've known Adriana for several years, and it's just thrilling to have her here with us. Adriana is professor of history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She teaches Latin American and Jewish history there. Her book, Sephardi, Jewish, Argentine, Creating Community and National Identity from 1880 to 1960, appeared in 2016. She's written numerous articles and book chapters on Sephardi food, schools, beauty contests, and on Latin American Jewish history in general. She's done a lot, so much, to further the growth of the field of Latin American Jewish studies, and perhaps more than any other scholar working in the US right now. She co-edited with Ranan Rine The New Jewish Argentina, Facets of Jewish Experience in the Southern Cone, which won the LACSA Best Book Award in 2013. Her most recent publication is a co-edited volume called Jews Across the Americas, which she did with Laura Liebman. And this is an amazing resource for students and teachers. I've used it. I highly recommend it. We have online access to it through our catalog. So I really encourage everyone to take a look at this resource. And Adriana is also one of the editors of the multi-volume Brill Encyclopedia on Jewish Life in Latin America, which is also going to be a huge contribution to this topic. Right now, she is co-president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. She's also been active in making sure that the Association of Jewish Studies in the U.S. includes both Latin American and Sephardi and Mizrahi topics in its programming. She is currently finishing a manuscript on Argentine Sephardi youth, and that is what she will be speaking from today. So please join me in welcoming Adriana Brodsky.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the Jewish Studies program and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, in particular, Estelle Tarica and Ethan Katz, for making this visit possible. Also to the staff of the Jewish Studies program and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese for arranging the details of my stay here. Today's presentation, and I'm going to silence this a little bit, is part of a project in which I analyze the role the metaphor of youth and youth themselves played amongst Jewish Argentines, in particular Sephardim, from 1940, when young Sephardim founded the Sephardi Zionist Youth Department of the of the Centro Sionista Sephardi, to the beginning of the military dictatorship in 1976. The book argues that as Jews were persecuted and murdered in 1940s Europe, the Jewish Argentine community looked to youth for salvation. In light of the growth of anti-Semitism, both abroad and at home, and fearing assimilation into Argentine society, Jews asked its young not simply for religious adherence, but most importantly for developing and maintaining a strong identification with the Jewish people, its history, and its then future home. Jewish Argentine youth responded to these pleas for action, and those responses were grounded in local and regional realities. During these early decades, Sephardi youth founded groups outside of the main Zionist youth movements in an effort to reach Sephardim. They believed Zionism was the answer for keeping youth Jewish, but also grounded in the specificity of the Sephardi experience that required Sephardi solutions led by young Sephardim. The notion that Sephardim could only be reached by other Sephardim would continue through the decades that I focus. What slowly changed was how Zionism was understood by these various groups. While in the 1940s, Zionism tended to remain focused on the creation of the Jewish state, fundraising, etc., in later decades, it would become informed by local concerns. Ruben P., for example, a founding member of Tehezakna, a Zionist Sephardi youth group of the late 1950s, and which will be the focus of my presentation today, told me, and I quote, "I got to Zionism through socialism. I was politically active in university and in high school," he continued, "and I learned the ropes of how to be a Zionist activist in the laica or libre struggles of the late 1950s in Buenos Aires," end of quote. This response, detailing his participation in the struggles against the groups wishing to establish private Catholic universities in Argentina, reveals how Ruben's work as a Sephardi Zionist youth movement leader came to be shaped by local struggles and expectations placed on Argentine, not exclusively Jewish, youth. Many of the ideals and tactics he utilized with the Jewish group youth he led had come not just from his training in Israel, where he attended a leadership seminar in 1961, or from the Zionist emissaries sent by the Jewish Agency to train local leaders, but as much from his experience as a high school and university student in an Argentina engulfed in the educational and political conflicts of the post-Peronist and post-Cuban Revolution period. But the Zionist projects that these young Sephardim developed would bring about important changes to their communities in Argentina. Jewish Argentine youth molded ways of belonging to the Jewish people that included moving to Palestine, Israel, while retaining Argentine identity, as well as remaining in Argentina committed to both their ethnic, Argentine national, and diasporic Sephardic identities. The book then presents a story about youth enacting change and creating belongings in a transnational world, and it narrates a chronological arc that began with the request of youth to be mobilized in the wake of the Holocaust and ends with a call to demobilize, given the fear their activism instilled in their communities before and with the arrival of the military dictatorship in 1976. The young Sephardim who became involved in Zionist youth groups were members of Sephardi communities from various origins. A minority group in Argentina, Sephardim were never accounted for more than 20% of the Jewish Argentine community. Once in Argentina, these Sephardi groups, and I do include Arabic speakers since that's what they call themselves, the Sephardim, included Jews from Morocco, Turkey, former Ottoman Empire, and then Jews from Aleppo and Damascus, which were always also part of the Ottoman Empire, initially maintaining their particular local identities by each organizing their own immigrant associations, name them all, butchers, doctors, mutual aid societies, religious schools, synagogues, etc., and settling in distinct Buenos Aires neighborhoods, rarely crossing paths. This is what the city of Buenos Aires looks like if you were to look at it from above. Moroccan Jews, for example, had settled in the southern neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, Constitución, that's the synagogue that they built in 1925 and which Einstein attended. Jews from Damascus settled in the Boca and Barracas, also in the south part of the city, as well as in the neighborhood of Flores, where they still can be found. Jews from Aleppo established their own institutions in the neighborhood of Once, perhaps the most famous of Jewish neighborhoods of the city. And then Jews from Izmir, we have here the Shalom congregation, which you will hear about in the rest of the talk, which brought together the communities from Rhodes and Salonika. They settled in the Colegiales neighborhood. And then Camargo, which was the central congregation that brought together Jews from Izmir and Istanbul in Villa Crespo, another important Jewish neighborhood. So alongside Sephardim, there's Ashkenazim. By the 1960s, however, new places of sociability, like Argentine schools and the university system, brought these groups into greater contact with each other as well as with Ashkenazim. Their attending high school, Argentine schools and universities also meant that they began to be active in school and university events and groups like student union centers, coming into contact with fellow students who were not Jewish. So this presentation centers on the 1960s and 1970s, a period that was also studied by various historians in connection with Jewish youth. Alumni from Berkeley, Beatrice Gurvitz, for example, described in her book, Argentine Jews in the Age of Revolt, young Jewish Argentines' attraction to and admiration for various global rebellions and the interrelated rise of the New Left during this period. These young Jews had been active participants in the efforts of the Jewish community leadership and Shlichim from Israel, where they had become familiar with socialist ideals. Yet these young Jews increasingly felt that the New Left rejected them, given that they increasingly associated Zionism as a colonial project and Israel as an outpost for US imperialism. In a Latin American reality in which the forces of change were coming from the New Left, the inability to be part of it, or at least not to be accepted fully, was not taken lightly by these young Jews. Many members of nationalist Argentine groups were speaking against Zionism as not compatible with Argentina and with those in the country involved in defeating imperialist and anti-nationalist liberation movements. Gurvitz shows that many young Zionist Jews, in an effort to retain their commitment to New Left ideals, reconfigured Zionism as, I quote, a revolutionary national liberation movement that was the product of decolonization, end of quote. This understanding of Zionism, she shows, meant that the personal and national liberation from the colonizer was tied to Aliyah, that is to say, go and live in Israel, and the actual state of Israel itself. This recasting of Zionism meant that life in the diaspora needed to end, and the assumption that those that did not go to Israel would be assimilated, and that Jewish institutional leaders and the institutions had to work towards making Aliyah for everybody a reality. Now, this recasting of Zionism did not only occur amongst Zionist youth groups. This quote from the original issue of the magazine Raíces, Roots, which appeared in the wake of the Six-Day War, when these accusations of the New Left became more visible, shows the attempts by Jews and youth in particular, as they were involved in the edition of this magazine, their attempts to merge their commitments to both Zionism and, if not openly, to the ideology of the New Left, at least to a sense of Jewish humanism and the fact that Jews were attuned to what was going in the world. We are, the editors of the magazine claimed, democratic and sympathetic to all those who are oppressed around the world, regardless of their ethnic origin, the color of their skin, or the name of their God. We're also enemies of any open or covert type of racist or ideological discrimination. We clearly hope for peace, and we hate war. And since we're talking about peace, we sincerely wish for peace between Israel and the Arab peoples. We also want a peace that is not imposed by arms, but based on freedom and the self-determination of the nations. And all of these positions derive from our condition of judíos conscientes, Jews who are involved and people with Jewish identity. Raíces then presented the possibility for youth to imagine themselves as part of the larger struggles of Latin America and the world, while not forgetting their Jewish identity. In fact, it was, in their words, their Jewish identity, their conciencia judía, that made them receptive to understanding and wishing to collaborate with those liberation struggles. While Gurvitz focuses her attention on the attempts by young Zionists to articulate a way that allowed them to remain committed to both Zionism and the New Left and Third Worldism, Adriana Krupnik on the other hand, has written about those who transitioned from Zionist movements to Argentine guerrilla groups during this period. Michael Rom similarly has focused on this trajectory amongst Brazilian young Jews. Krupnik, while recognizing that not all young Jews who had been active in Zionist movements ended up joining the Argentine guerrilla groups, reminds us that many did, and that their presence in these guerrilla movements was not exceptional, but actually one choice amongst many options available for young Jews. Their choice to join in these guerrilla groups, Krupnik argues, suggests not only their integration into Argentine society, but also their desire to deepen that commitment with participation in the armed struggle to change the inequity structures that plagued many Latin American nations. These historians and my own work have painted then a picture of the options Jewish youth involvement had available to them in the 1960s and in the early 1970s. Young Jews then could participate in local Jewish institutions as members of social, non-politicized groups, some more Zionist or less, more oriented to entertainment and providing options for socializing than others, as can be seen here in some of the institutions that advertised the attendance of youth. And I'll be more than happy to come and explain, some of these if you're interested. They could also be part of Zionist youth groups preparing and demanding support for Aliyah, as either informed by religious convictions, although more study really needs to focus on this group of religious Zionists, or by the belief that Zionism was the Jewish national liberation movement, and specifically after 1969, which was the moment in which participation in local politics by these Zionist movements was discouraged. And I'm not going to talk about that, but I'll be happy to tell you in Q&A if you're interested in why is it that in 1969 the possibility of these youth to also participate in local politics came to an end. They could also be part, and here are the two groups that I was talking about. The Hashomer Said was one, but not the only one. And Baderech, both these groups are actually imagining Aliyah or moving to Israel as the Jewish national liberation movement. And or they could be part of a few groups that attempted to retain an open Jewish identity with participation in national politics, at least until they eventually made their move to Israel. And this is the Juventud Sionista Socialista, which, as you can see, just participated in the streets of Buenos Aires with the regular Argentine left, and or the AMOS, which was the Movimiento AMOS, the movement of leftist Zionism, which was also a group that was very active in the non-Jewish leftist street. Of course, concurrent with all these options, they could, and many did, become part of these Jewish self-defense units, fighting by hand or with sticks against right-wing members of groups like Tacuara, who were horribly violent in the streets of Argentina, especially after 1962, after 1960 with the kidnapping of Eichmann in Buenos Aires. Of course, they could not be at all included in any Jewish activity, and many did so. Some of these options that I've just outlined would become very difficult after the 1976 coup in Argentina, where all youth were suspect of being subversives. But a look at Sephardim and youth rebellion and politicization during this period adds some nuance to this already rich picture. The Sephardi Zionist youth groups that I studied grew within Sephardi social institutions as integral parts of them, as the response imagined by youth and initially supported by the leadership of these institutions to the needs to provide relevant environments to bring young Jews back into Jewish institutions. Historian Valeria Manzano, who writes about the age of youth in Argentina, not Jewish youth in particular, reminds us that youth socialization became increasingly important starting in 1950s, especially during Perón's government, who, in her words, mobilized youth as a cultural category and as actors. Fear that youth would flock to socialization spaces that were not Jewish, institutions, certainly not all, slowly opened their doors and called in these Sephardi young who were becoming organized. Now, many of these groups that grew in communities, the communities that I showed you the synagogues of in those first few slides, in many cases created collectives, practically demonstrating that the distinctions that had existed with the immigrant generation of divisions by origin meant nothing to them. And I have here an example that grew, and that I will not talk about today, that grew out of a variety of small little clubs and Sephardi congregations in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Echalutz Techezakna, a group that was clearly preparing, and many eventually did move to live on kibbutzim in Israel. Now, for this presentation, finally, I'm going to be talking about Techezakna. This was a group that started in very early 1960s and which, again, I will just very briefly explain how they came together, but it is a collective. So Techezakna is not a group from members of just only one group, but actually the collection of several Sephardi communities. Techezakna eventually, and so I'm giving you a sense of the way, what came before Techezakna and what will come after Techezakna. Techezakna starts in early 1960s, and it will join the Movimiento Juvenil Sephardi Sionista that had developed at around the same time. It was also a collective, so again, not from one congregation or group, to found the group Baderech, which was very active in the 70s and eventually would lose its Sephardi specificity as the young Sephardim were expelled from Sephardi institutions. So, Techezakna was a Sephardi youth collective that began around 1961 when young people from two communities, Or Torah, which I showed you, was the community founded by families from the city of Damascus, Arabic speakers, and from the congregation of Shalom in Colegiales, whose families had come from the Balkans and Rhodes. Groups from those two sides met by chance in the port of Haifa as one group was returning to Buenos Aires and the other was about to start their experience in the Mahom Lemadrichim, the institution that would train future youth leaders in Israel. Now, the youth from the Or Torah community had existed from some years prior to the creation of Techezakna, and in the latter part of the 1950s had managed to force the leadership of Or Torah to relinquish a property that was only being used for playing cards so the young could meet in it and organize their activities. And we can talk a little bit about, I'm not going to go into detail, but if you wonder what the heck were they doing in these properties, I'll be more than happy to give you examples of what they did. And while they were not allowed to meet during Fridays, so keeping Shabbat was something that these Sephardi young people had to fight at Shabbat, Friday evenings and then during the day on Saturdays. At least it was a start that they had a place. Youth had no place in these communities. Now, what is interesting is that at the return, whenever they met after their meeting in the port of Haifa, these young men discussed the need to create a Chalutzi Center for Sephardim. For those of you who are not familiar, maybe I don't need to explain that, but the Chalutzi movement is kind of a pioneering movement, training people to live in the kibbutz. And they said, you know what? There's nothing like that exists at this point in Argentina. We need to create this movement. Now, they agreed that in order to be able to make it work among Sephardim, they had to stay away from politics, create an independent movement from any other larger existing organizations, and perhaps create a kibbutz where families of Sephardi origin would let their kids go to. The idea of mingling with others was something they knew was going to be a hurdle. Now, by May 1962, then Tehezakna, we have here the invitation to an event that they organized in one of the neighborhoods. It was working with close to 80 young people in the neighborhood of Barracas with Or Torah. In December, they organized a festivity, and then they also planned for organizing a summer camp. So within a year of their founding, there's all these young people that join these groups, and they are able to create a very there's a seder that is organized by them, in which young kids perform the exodus from Egypt. Tons of kids are being involved, this is a sort of a jolt, an injection of optimism. The program, the larger two pieces over there, for a first artistic festival that they actually put on in 1963, give us some clues about how they perceived their role. And so, I think it's a little dark here, but over here, those of you who read Spanish might peek at what they said their objective was: to deprive the youth of a Jewish education imbued with national and social awareness is to lead them to assimilation. So again, the idea here is that youth are coming together, they're deciding to organize these pioneer groups with the intention of stalling assimilation into Argentina, into the larger Jewish community that was not Sephardi. So these are some of the things that are coalescing here together. The small leadership of Tehezakna, which were the ones that had been to Israel, who were the ones trained into being leaders of younger kids, found eventually Hashomer HaTzair's ideology the most compatible with their own ideas, even though they're going to remain completely independent from them. They have different uniforms. They have different words for the centers where they meet. They do not want anything to look like, smell like, or be like the Hashomer, because they know that the families are going to be very much against that. So from the very beginning, the only reason why they did join Hashomer HaTzair is that allowed them to get slots in the Machon LeMadrichim, courses that were being taught in Israel. In the first issue of Chazak, which was the newspaper they published from August 1963 to August 1965, They claimed they were seeking to bring Sephardim out of a reality in which they existed, youth existed, and I quote here, without horizons, without objectives. Let us work within each community, they declared. Sephardim, they argued, were distinct, and I quote here, the family circle was tight and not open to the outside. The cultural level was unfortunately low. The most urgent problem for Sephardi youth, in their words, was the lack of ideals, the lack of a dynamic vision of the world, the lack of a desire to fight, which is actually one of the characteristics of their age, they argued. Youth also lack a Sephardi structure in which they can develop these desires to fight, to have a dynamic vision. The Chezakna then, in the founder's words, was created in order to provide the ideals, the education, and to facilitate a combative spirit, to make angry young Jews. Now, because they were not part of Hashomer HaTzair, which had a building and where everybody met, this meant that the Chezakna had to meet, and that's what they wanted, inside the Sephardi community centers. And of course, this desire created and generated conflict, a lot of conflict between the leadership of these congregations and these youth. It was different in Or Torah. By the 60s, Or Torah had already fought the battle with the previous group, but it was in Shalom, in the community founded by families from Rhodes, where the most contentious battles started. Hierarchy was this relationship. They were suspended from being in charge of youth activities in December 1962, so just after a couple of months after they had started. They returned in 1963 for about a month. Then they were rejected again. They were back in June 1964 until 1966 when they were expelled forever. They could never go back. And these are the children of members of these communities. So these are not, people that nobody knows. Here is what they wrote in 1963 after being kicked out of Shalom because they were told that they could not put on a performance that they had been working on for a while. Kids had created their costumes. Somebody was going to be Herzl, somebody was going to be Bialik, and they were going to, act. The message, this was a little booklet that they distributed to all the members of the congregation, inquiring as to why they were being labeled problematic. And they ask in this piece, what problems do we bring? It is not clear to us what it is that we are doing. And on the small little flyer over there, which was attached, you see this is very homemade. There's no structure, administrative structure that can take photocopies, and these are the kids themselves, that are making these things. On this flyer, which was also distributed, they stated, and I quote here, "Youth is ideas, and barbarians, ideas cannot be killed." Quoting, for those that are familiar with this, Argentine founding father Domingo Sarmiento, "Bárbaros, las ideas no se matan." And then they finish, what we are trying to do for our own benefit will benefit all members in the long run. Come on, people. During the longer period in which they stayed in Shalom, between 1964 and 1966, the Chezakna members organized activities according to age, with the bulk of activities taking place during the weekends, a contentious issue given Shabbat, and which suggests that some leaders were able to compromise. The 1964 steering committee's understanding of the importance of youth translated into financial support for the activities they held weekly, even if it meant inconveniencing adult members of the club who used rooms for card playing. Again, what was it about card playing that they could not give up these spaces for youth? A discussion regarding the need to move the card-playing group to a smaller room in order to accommodate a youth group's dance ended up with most members of the steering committee deciding that the activity for the young was more important. And so what we see is that Tejezakna, in this third round of trying to make a permanent space in this institution, realized what to pay attention to get a little bit more understanding. First of all, at all the meetings, they continuously reported how many children were participating, how many new members the club was getting because of the involvement of the youth, and how much money was being raised for the congregation. Eventually they organized winter camps and summer camps that the leadership of Shalom are more than happy to support. Actually, rather than having Tejezakna members have to fundraise mostly amongst their own family members to be able to afford, because again, Hashomer Said is not participating. They just need to raise every single amount of pesos, to do what they are interested in doing. And last but not least, they also chose to describe themselves, even though they are about being a pioneering group, all that, they describe themselves as an educational movement instead of a Zionist youth group, in order to avoid the association with Aliyah and the association with some left-wing Zionist groups like Hashomer Said. But with the election of a new steering committee in March 1966, Tejezakna's work with Shalom came to an end. It never came back. Parents had complained that Tejezakna appeared to represent political ideas and that Shalom was supposed to be an apolitical space. More importantly, they claimed their children were exhibiting rebellious nature at home since they had begun participating in these groups, and complained that young people's commitment to the activities organized by Tejezakna, in particular the annual end-of-the-year events, actually prevented them from studying for their final exams at high school and at university. In Argentina, the calendar year is the school year, so the end of the year means that students were not paying attention to their studies. Now, what we can also see from the surviving material is that the Tejezakna leaders created to some flyers, or actually booklets, in their work with the older groups who were working towards Aliyah, suggests that they felt part of the Argentine and Latin American reality that needed change. For example, some of the teaching tools focused on the concept of daily life and alienation, but providing concrete examples from the city of Buenos Aires. Within this text, which is on, as I said, daily life and alienation, the working class, they learned, members of Tejezakna, the older members of Tejezakna, learned about the hypocrisy regarding women's and men's sexuality, this idea that women, had to remain virgin, and, people celebrated men's promiscuity, about the role of mass culture, providing, of course, as examples, Palito Ortega, the Argentine Elvis, and the rise of Peronism. These examples provide evidence to the fact that Jewish youth in the 60s wished to be discussing and thinking about the reality that surrounded them, but in Jewish spaces with their fellow Jews. These readings also make them think about the problems identified by Marxist theory and how they could be solved. It likely provided Jewish youth, those attending these talks or meetings, with the ability to talk with their non-Jewish mates while at high school and in university. And the focus of these lessons also show that for many Jews, moving out of the Jewish circles into non-Jewish political spaces was very likely very easy. The trajectory of Tejezakna in Shalom, marked by conflict and compromise, allows for a few insights, and I'm coming to an end over here. The autonomy sought by the youth in terms of their work was difficult to maintain its practice, as they required a leadership in these communities that allowed them in. The leadership and the membership of these institutions found youth to be rebellious, to not respect the elders who were the leaders, and to be disruptive. This clash, as we've seen, resulted in the expulsion of Tejezakna from this communal space. The other problem that was something that members of the leadership and parents complained about was that everybody was being trained to leave Argentina and settle in Israel. This objective, which even though it tried to be hidden because they were an educational movement, as you know, in their own words, actually became very clear when the groups and the different stages, would declare their intention to leave in 1964 and 1966, which coincides with moments in which Tejezakna was kicked out of Shalom. While financial supporters of Israel, the parents of these kids that are attending these activities did not want their children to leave them behind, to not take up the store or to not be in charge of the store that the father owned. This was the idea, right? That if they left, right, all these ideals or all these dreams that they had about their family life would be gone. So let me just offer a few conclusions about what I see we add to the existing discussions about youth, Zionist youth, Jewish youth in Argentina when we pay attention to Sephardim. First of all, the creation, or at least the struggle to create a new type of Sephardi institution, one which was not necessarily religious, involving ritual or prayer, or purely social, card playing, for example, but which was interested in teaching Jewish culture and Jewish nationalism. This was a massive contribution that these groups did to the Sephardi congregations and Sephardi organizations that existed until then. The next important contribution was that as a solution to assimilation, these groups sought and did bring back the youth, the Jewish youth, into these community circles. They also were able to introduce the ideas of Aliyah and Chalutziyut, pioneering, to a population that had mostly understood Zionism in religious terms. This one is one that did not, was not very much presented by the evidence that I shared with you, but that was significant about the history of the previous group that I mentioned, Echalutz Tejezakna. The fact that these youth movements allowed for the socialization of Sephardi women outside of the home. So grandmothers were roped in to go to these camps, overnight camps, because girls could not leave the home without, chaperones. Zionist youth movements contributed to and fed from the politicization of Argentine youth in the late 1950s onwards. There's a story that has been quoted by Shlomo Zlutsky, who went to live in Israel, in which he talks about a young woman who was participating in an event organized by a leftist political organization. And they're all singing songs that are shared by everybody at the event. And somebody begins to sing a Yiddish song. And she gets a little bit nervous and it's like, well, and then many people in the room begin to join in with this idea, so that there was amongst Argentine, Jewish youth who move into, these political groups, their trajectory in the Zionist youth groups was important. These youth movements became a channel for the expression of generational conflict. Everything was related between the old, who are stagnant, conservative, unable incorporate change. They're going to be the death of the Jewish community versus the young, the ones that have ideals, the ones that have the energy, the ones that are ready to struggle. And then last but not least, these groups shaped generations of community leaders, Sephardi community leaders in Argentina and in Latin America, because in many cases they were sent out to be emissaries. These Zionist Sephardi youth movements did not then only and simply produce pioneers for the new state. In fact, only a very small minority of all these Sephardim who participated in these groups actually ended up moving to Israel, but also modernized Sephardi women, and I use modernized, of course, in quotes, consolidated and grounded Argentine Sephardim to their lands. And finally, the movements were shaped and developed in conversation with local, national, and transnational institutions and people. Thank you.
Adriana, thank you so much for that. We're going to have time for questions and answers, and I'd like to have the people speak into the mic, so I'll be coming around. Is that a question over here, John? Okay.
Oops.
Thanks, Adriana. So I'm not clear exactly, other than your first point about the establishment of Sephardic institutions and institution building, which is clearly important. I'm not clear on the content, the Sephardic content of these organizations and how they would have differed from, let's say, predominantly Ashkenazic Zionist youth movements. So, were there lessons in Sephardic history? Was there anything done to bolster the Sephardic identity? Because I didn't hear much about that.
Oh, I have my microphone. I can talk without needing the other microphone. Yes, thank you for that question. There was always this desire to make sure that, these Sephardi youth did not cross into the Ashkenazi side, right? And initially, because they were imagined to be very foreign, some of the songs that they would sing were in Yiddish, and nobody spoke Yiddish in the Sephardi groups. Eventually, what we will see is a sort of a coming up with alternatives to create their own Sephardi groups of songs, which are in Ladino, and so some of them they begin to to sing even songs in Arabic that were part of the the communities that these kids were coming from. I think that more than just always becoming with alternatives to the Ashkenazi groups, I think that what they were most sure of was that if you wanted to introduce Zionism and pioneer, Chalutzut, you needed to understand the mentality of how these groups were going to react to your wanting to get in and do it. And so in a sense, they were one step ahead. Oh, like, I know they're going to come and they're going to tell us that the girls cannot come out at night to these events. So they created, just somebody would go into the homes of where girls lived and go pick them up and bring them back so that parents would be informed. There was this sense that this could not happen. We could not draw the kids in until we, make it possible for the families who have these limitations, given this sense of backwardness or lack of modernity or things like that. And so in a sense, more than just harping on or creating a Sephardi or recreating a Sephardi culture is sort of this sense of understanding what they're up against. That somebody that does not emerge from this environment would not figure that out, and then they would fail, right? So they erect themselves as the vanguard because they know who they're dealing with or what they're dealing with in terms of, of their ability to get, all these kids talking about, Israel, talking about Jewish history, when they had not gotten that at home, right? So I don't know if you're not convinced.
No.
Oh.
It's just that, Sephardic culture is in some respects more fractured than Ashkenazi culture insofar as, so you have groups that come from Arabic-speaking countries. You have groups where Ladino at one point would have been the lingua franca. So how do you actually even unify in terms of, beyond calling oneself a Sephardic group?
Mm-hmm.
That
was hard.
Yeah.
I remember that, people would say, well, my grandmother would come with us and explain to the mother of the house, oh, you know me, you know my grandfather, we, our parents were, so come on, allow your kid to join us or to join, this young generation. So there was a lot more, a lot more work that had to be, put into convincing these people who reacted, by being extremely cautious. I don't know, who are you? Are you this family? Are you related to this family? If I don't know you, well, I'm not going to let my kids go to a camp with you.
Right.
And so there was a lot more that needed to happen. And the Sephardi, the Tchezakna members said, we know what we need to do. I will get my grandmother to go and talk to your grandmother and convince her, right, that it's okay. We will walk women back home when our peulot finish late. So we'll do the work of silencing some of the things that they're going to say, so as not to let the kids participate. And so we will be able to overcome those obstacles. And that's the only way in which this will work. That's the only word. That's what they saw was their biggest contribution to this, right? That unless these excuses, right, could not be overcome, these kids were going to stay at home or coming to the club only to play soccer or to play basketball, and that was it. No access, right, to all this other content, right, that Tchezakna wanted to.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I've really enjoyed seeing the architecture of the synagogues.
Oh.
And the whole talk was immensely interesting. I hope you'll forgive the simplicity of this question. And it's twofold. Firstly, why was there Zionism in Argentina in the first place? How does that sort of come to be? And secondly, if part of, or if the entire answer is because of a fear of assimilation, what did they think that assimilation meant? What was it exactly that they were afraid of?
Overall, Zionism was presented by the Jewish community in the 1940s as the solution to assimilation, in order to avoid assimilation. And the people are sort of, looking at some Jews who are studying, who are becoming successful, who start having money, and they say, if we don't keep them grounded in a Jewish identity, and at that time, the solution that they came up with is we need to teach them about Jewish nationalism, that we are a Jewish nation, that we have, right, this history behind us, that we have, all these desires to help, Jews. And so, in a sense, Zionism, not necessarily as understood as everybody needs, eventually needs to go and live in Israel, but rather the idea of a shared identity, right, that could be, that could coexist with their lives in Argentina, but kind of participating in communities, not exclusively around religion, because that was always the fact that Argentina is a very secular, it's a Catholic country, but it's a very secular country. And so religion was not going to act as the founding, right, element of grouping. And so Jewish history, Jewish, Jewish contributions of Jewish people, Zionism, the fact that we are all members of a nation, if not necessarily associated with the state itself, but also eventually they did. That is what they came up with, as this is what we're going to need to do in order to prevent these Jews from not associated and imagining themselves as being Jewish. And so I think that that's what they feared, right? That they would not have any connections, right, to anybody else because they lacked the glue, right? They imagined that Argentina was going to be able to provide them with economic advancement, which might have been one of the reasons why people were coming to Argentina, persecution, but in many cases it was for economic advancement. And once they were able to make it in Argentina, they were just gonna, become Argentines, so fully Argentines that they would not even, have these connections with their past, with their history, and with the future, right, of the community as well. Was that? Okay. Yeah, and I think that in particular, the educational system in Argentina was free. It was mandatory, so everybody needed to send their children to elementary school. And so the sense that there was no Jewish education, right, that could, right, kind of instill some of this information that was not available otherwise was also important. And yeah, and to them, Jewish education certainly was not, right, reading and knowing the prayers, right? I mean, these are modern Jews who are not, right, interested in and who do not think, right, that being Jewish is knowing the prayers.
Thank you, Adriana. That was such a fascinating and rich talk. I can't wait to read the book. Can you say a little bit more about the sort of formation of a narrative about Zionism that you spoke about in the sort of first part of the talk as a national liberation movement connected to other movements of decolonization, sort of how that came about, how successful they were in building alliances for at least the time, and then also sort of how that came unwound. That's one question. And the second question is just, I didn't really quite know whether that bore any real relationship over time to the groups that you then focused on that were specifically Sephardic Zionist youth groups, whether there was any crossover, I felt like maybe into this sort of
guerrilla movements
or yeah, I mean, and you know the material. I don't really know the movements, the material, so I don't know whether they were all guerrilla movements, whether there were some of these Zionists who were involved in political activism, not guerrilla activism per se, who were part of this story that B. Gurwitz writes about. Yeah, so I was just curious if there was any crossover, and maybe part of the answer to one of these questions is the 1969 significance, which I want to give you a chance to tell us why that's such an important turning point.
Right. Okay. I keep forgetting. So the 1961 was a watershed in that whereas some of the Zionist youth movements like Hashomer Hatzair, the Chalutz LaMerchav, had not said anything if Jews were participating in their high school student center, which were very politicized, by the way, where perhaps many of these kids had become members of the Peronist Youth Party, and that was okay. These movements never said anything about that dual participation of these members. In 1969, there was the Cordobazo, which was a huge, protest, popular protest in the streets that resulted in many deaths in Cordoba, but then it actually moved into the city of Buenos Aires. The military were part of the government in 1960. in the 60s. And so there was an event in which a member of a trade union was shot by the police, and there are witnesses. And the witnesses are a young man from the Damascene community of La Boca, who belonged to not Tejezacna, because by then Tejezacna had joined the Movimiento Juvenil Sephardi Sionista and had formed Baderech. So he was a member of Baderech. He saw when the police actually shot the guy in the back as the guy was running. And he begins to tell his friends at the University of Buenos Aires that the official description of the event was that the guy was shooting, and then the police responded, and then that was what caused the death. And he says, that's BS. I saw it from a Jewish club, from Maccabi Sports Club. And he said that he was willing to denounce that the official version was a mistake, was wrong. And so there is a press conference gets called. He says his name. He does not mention the organization that he belongs to, Baderech. He says that he saw the event and that he is doubting the veracity of the official version. He's taken to jail. He spends in jail for about 3 weeks, 2 weeks and a half, 3 weeks. He actually describes the fact that he does not feel like he can say he's Jewish. He does not feel like he can say he is a member of any left-wing group, because he's not a member of any party. And while he is agonizing inside about his impossibility, the fact that he feels like I did the right thing, anybody should have done what I did, he feels that, already knows that the price he's going to have to pay is too big. The problem is outside. Baderech leadership deposes him. He was the secretary of Baderech, deposes him in absentia, and signs a sort of a call for anybody who participates in these Zionist youth movements to not become involved in local politics, that they are in a sense endangering the rest of the group. And from that moment on, these larger institutions, in the case of Baderech, it is Hashomer Hatzair as well, they start telling you, okay, I know that you go and you participate in this soup kitchen. You cannot do that anymore, because if you get grabbed, then you might say some things about the institution. And so 1969 becomes the moment in which people started to need to choose whether they wanted to remain involved in national politics or whether they would stay in that Zionist framework. There's a couple of these two groups, the Juventud Socialista Sionista, which very short, and then the Amos group that also for very short, they keep trying to do both. But as the 70s kind of move in, and as the situation of violence in the streets and the repression of the government speed up, then it becomes almost, people get frozen and they don't know, how to react. And so, what these Zionist groups are doing in the late 1960s and early 70s, mostly, I don't know exactly, and this is not the work that I've done, but we should ask B to tell us exactly. A lot of what B describes, it's how these young Jews are talking to the authorities of Jewish institutions and saying, we need to talk about Zionism as a national liberation movement of Jews, and the sort of, in the context of colonialism. And so it is mostly they're asking their leadership of the Jewish communities, organizations, to be able to see people. You will get all the leftist Jews. They're going to come and join us, because they will be able to see that there is a possibility of combining these two things. So mostly it is an internal kind of Jewish internal change that gets enacted. And these are mostly the people that the young Jews are talking to. Although I've heard some Sephardi young man who said, whenever they would tell me, the national liberation, I would say, well, Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jews, and so that it also allowed them the possibility of using the same language that was out in the streets, for them also not to feel so much. Somebody said, well, we created the Juventud Sionista Socialista, the youth, socialist and Zionist youth, because whenever they came up, everybody would come up to you and say, where are you a militant in? Which group are you part of? I would say Baderech, and they would say, what? Hashem, what? So we came up with Juventud Sionista Socialista, which was also a collective of a lot of Zionist Sephardi and not Sephardi groups that joined. So again, the language, the commonality with the larger leftist street is what allowed them to feel like at least they were trying. And again, towards the 1973 with Cámpora and Perón, then it becomes almost impossible.
Adriana, I wanted to use my moderator privilege to ask a question, and then I see that there are more from the audience. I was really curious about one of the logos for the group that looks like four hands, and they look like they, in the graphic, are of different colors. So could you tell us a little bit about, I don't know if this is something you've studied or you know the answer to, what do those hands represent?
Unity, that's what they said. We wanted to do something that provided that we were all, different, and it's handmade. So, they came up with.
Do you think it's a specifically Sephardic? Like these are the four communities of Sephardim?
No, I think
okay.
It's larger than. It's
okay.
like again, sort of this echoing these ideas of, all creeds, all all races, all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
you. Yeah, thank you for your talk, but that kind of serves as a perfect segue to my question. So I've read that Ashkenazi Jews came to Latin America and they were more open to Zionism and left-leaning ideals. And you're talking of the Sephardic community who were the older community were at least not as open to those ideals, and so the youth had to try harder. Was the Ashkenazi community also helping the Sephardic community advocate for Zionism and left-leaning ideals too, or what was the dynamic there? I remember you mentioning a person singing a Yiddish song and then they join in. Was that an Ashkenazi person?
Right. So part of the reason why Ashkenazi might have been more open, is that in many cases, they had encountered Zionist groups in Europe prior to their arrival to Argentina. Sephardim, except for those that lived in some regions of the Balkans where there was where some of these groups had arrived and had started their work amongst youth. Whenever they went to Argentina, they were more aware of Zionism and they were more aware of these youth Zionist movements. By and by, the communities, some of these communities were not maybe familiar with religious Zionism, which is maybe what their parents must have, might have been more familiar with. But with Zionist youth groups, no. So that was a new thing that they had not really encountered prior to their arrival in Argentina. Now, I have to say, many Sephardi youth, maybe for different reasons, went straight to the non-Sephardi groups. So, there's examples of people joining the Hashomer Hatzair, even though they were Sephardim. And Hashomer Hatzair was imagined, as being embedded, right, in Ashkenazi culture. But what I found interesting is that, there was the desire, at least among some Sephardim, to create their own groups, right? And what these young people felt is that if Sephardim didn't do it, they were going to miss out on all these kids whose families would not let them join because they did not understand it, or because the young people themselves were not aware of what that was and how good it could be. And so in a sense, they become, right, what they call themselves the vanguard, right, of bringing Zionism to a population that had, until this point in time, been not connected, to it. So I interviewed some people who said, well, I once went to Hashomer Hatzair and I could not understand what that was. It was very foreign, to them. And so I decided I'm going to go back home and I'm going to call some friends and see whether we can start, something like this. This was the group in the 1940s. Because the idea was, I tried it, and it was just so foreign to me that, we should just create our own, right? Does that?
Yeah, sort of. But was there Ashkenazi support that assisted the Sephardic people?
Well, eventually, when Baderech and Terezakna both become associated with the Hashomer Hatzair, and so there you have all the people that are coming, the emissaries from Israel that are helping, that become the emissaries to these organizations. They go and they talk to the Sephardi leaders, and they provide whatever support. In fact, they're very happy that there are Sephardi youth that are doing the work for them, right? Because they might know that if they try to do it, they might encounter some of these, resistance, right, from the community, because the community doesn't know, who's this guy? Who's this guy asking my kid to join? I'm like, no, I'm not letting, So in a sense, these emissaries are very happy when the Sephardim themselves are doing the job.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I have just one more question, Adriana, maybe more later, but just for now, is this a specific? I'm wondering if this is a very specifically Latin American story that you're telling.
I think so.
Because just off the top of my head, it's somewhat unusual to have a breakdown of Zionist groups according to, Ashkenazic origin and Sephardic origin. It almost defeats the purpose of the unifying power and force of Zionism. So is there something that, I just don't know the answer to the question. I have no idea, and what I know about, Jewish history in Argentina, I learned principally from Estelle's book, so or modern anyway, the modern period anyway. Do we see something like this in Brazil, for example, or any other Latin America, or is it even specifically an Argentinian phenomenon?
Great question, right? I think that the sort of the politicization of Latin America, right, is the big backdrop against which all Sephardi youth movements in Latin America are going to be, right, sort of part of and shaped by, right, this outside. So that part of the story, I think, is Latin American in more general. I think that Argentina has a very large Jewish community and also a very large Sephardi community from various origins. And so in some other countries in Latin America, there is less variety of Sephardi groups, right? And so that, in a sense, makes Argentina a strange or not very common case with the rest of Latin America, in that these groups kind of create parallel lives. And, they're just each, with very few instances in which they would come together, but they have their own, literally every community sets up their own network of help initially. And they seem to just be on these different tracks until mostly this point in time, when Zionism they create a Sephardi Zionist center. So that begins to be kind of an institution that starts bringing together people from different groups, but not all of them participate. But regardless, at least begins to become this glue, and then the youth kind of follow from that. And there are some communities that kind of emerge as being more represented, in some of these moments than in others. But I think it is, again, a combination of a Latin American story in terms of the larger politicization of youth, and then in the case of Argentina, this division of Sephardim is something that might be a lot more particular to Argentina.
Well, I think we will close it out there. And another round of applause for Adriana. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for those questions.
Thank you. Oh, the helicopters of